I'm Rebecca Johnson, 47 years old, and 6 months ago, my world completely shattered when my own father looked me in the eye at my birthday dinner and said I wasn't his real daughter. The humiliation of that moment in front of my entire family still makes my hands shake. But what my stepmother did next was even worse. If you've ever been made to feel like you don't belong in your own family, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this kind of betrayal. 23 years ago, I met David at a coffee shop near the university where I was finishing my master's in social work. He was hunched over a thick legal brief, his dark hair falling into his eyes as he scribbled notes in the margins. I'd noticed him there 3 times that week, always at the same corner table by the window that overlooked the campus quad. The barista had just called out my name for my usual vanilla latte when I saw him struggling with papers scattered everywhere, clearly overwhelmed. Something about his quiet intensity drew me in. I walked over and asked if he needed help organizing his materials. He looked up with these warm brown eyes and gave me this grateful smile that made my stomach flutter. "You must be an angel," he said, "because I'm definitely in legal hell right now." That terrible joke should have been my first red flag, but instead, it made me laugh. We spent the next 4 hours talking about everything from his dreams of becoming a family attorney to my passion for helping kids in the foster system. He smelled like coffee and determination, and when he walked me to my car that evening, the autumn air was crisp with the promise of something new beginning. Our early relationship was built on shared dreams and complementary strengths. David was methodical and careful, while I was intuitive and spontaneous. He'd spend Sunday mornings reading case studies while I experimented with new recipes, filling our tiny apartment with the smell of cinnamon rolls and fresh coffee. We'd take long walks through downtown, planning our future together. He wanted to specialize in family law to help kids like the ones I worked with. I wanted to eventually run my own therapeutic foster care program. We'd stay up late talking about the house we'd buy someday, with a big backyard for the children we hoped to have and foster. David had this habit of bringing me single daisies he'd pick from the campus gardens, never a whole bouquet, just one perfect flower he'd tuck behind my ear while telling me about his day. Those early years were filled with simple pleasures, sharing Chinese takeout from cardboard containers while studying, building furniture from secondhand stores, and discovering that we both sang terribly in the shower but didn't care. He proposed on the anniversary of that first meeting at the coffee shop, getting down on one knee right at our old table. The ring was modest but perfect, and when I said yes, the entire cafe applauded. The barista even gave us free coffee for a month. We were broke graduate students, but we were rich in hope and love. The 5 years that followed were everything we dreamed of building together. David graduated law school and landed a position with a respected family law firm, while I completed my clinical hours and got licensed as a family therapist. We bought a modest 2-story house in a neighborhood full of young families, with a front porch where we'd sit on summer evenings, watching kids ride bikes down the tree-lined street. Our morning routine became sacred. David would wake up first and bring me coffee in bed, and we'd spend 15 minutes just talking about our plans for the day. He'd leave little notes in my lunch bag, silly things like "you're going to change someone's life today," or "remember to eat the apple, not just the granola bar." We hosted dinner parties for our friends, turning our small dining room into a warm gathering place where people felt safe to share their struggles and dreams. David would grill on our tiny back deck while I made my grandmother's famous potato salad, and we'd all eat by candlelight, staying up until midnight solving the world's problems. Our careers flourished as we supported each other's goals. David won his first major custody case, involving a child being placed with loving grandparents instead of remaining in an abusive home. I successfully advocated for additional funding for our foster care program, helping us place 12 more children in permanent homes that year. We felt like a team, like we were actually making the difference we dreamed about during those long study sessions. On weekends, we'd drive to farmers markets, picking out fresh flowers for our kitchen table and trying samples of local honey while planning when to start our own family. This was our golden period, when everything felt possible and secure. Our typical Saturday would start with pancakes at our favorite diner, where the waitress knew to bring David black coffee and me hot chocolate with extra whipped cream. We'd read different sections of the newspaper to each other, sharing interesting stories while fighting over the crossword puzzle. Afternoons were spent working in our garden, David surprisingly good at growing tomatoes while I coaxed herbs to life in window boxes. We'd take evening walks through the neighborhood, stopping to chat with neighbors and dreaming about which house we'd buy when David made partner. Sunday mornings meant sleeping in until 9, then going to the small church down the street where we'd started volunteering with their youth program. We'd come home and spend hours on the couch, David reading legal journals while I graded reports from work, our feet intertwined, classical music playing softly in the background. Our future felt so certain. David would make partner within 3 years. We'd start trying for children soon after, and I'd eventually open my own practice, specializing in family therapy. We talked about taking a European vacation for our fifth anniversary, about the Christmas traditions we'd create for our kids, about growing old together on that front porch. Every night, David would tell me 3 things he was grateful for that day, and I was always one of them. Life felt stable, predictable, and beautifully ordinary. But looking back now, there were small cracks I should have noticed. David had started staying later at the office, claiming big cases and partnership pressure. He'd come home exhausted, less interested in our evening walks or weekend adventures. His phone buzzed constantly with texts he'd check quickly before putting it face down on the table. When I'd ask about his day, his responses became shorter, more generic. He stopped leaving notes in my lunch bag, stopped bringing me coffee in bed most mornings. The little touches that had defined our relationship began to fade so gradually I almost didn't notice. Friends started commenting that they hadn't seen us out together lately, and I realized David had been declining social invitations without telling me. Even our intimate moments became rushed, distracted, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. The morning that would change everything started like any other Tuesday, with me rushing to get ready for work, while David claimed he had an early meeting. But as I was leaving, I noticed his car was still in the driveway 20 minutes after he'd supposedly left. The foundation of everything I thought I knew about my family began with a lie I'd lived my entire life without knowing. My mother died when I was 3 years old, and my father remarried Linda when I was 5. Linda had 2 children from her previous marriage, my stepbrothers Marcus and Jake, who were 8 and 10 when we became a blended family. From the very beginning, the dynamics in our house were clear. Linda's boys were the priority, and I was the afterthought. My father, desperate to make his new marriage work and perhaps consumed by his own grief, seemed to forget that I existed half the time. Family photos from those years tell the story perfectly. Linda front and center with her arms around her sons, my father standing proudly beside them, and me usually off to the side or partially cut out of the frame entirely. During family meetings about household rules or vacation plans, Linda would speak for her boys while I sat quietly, learning early that my voice didn't carry the same weight. When Marcus wanted to play baseball, the whole family rearranged their schedules to accommodate practices and games. When I expressed interest in dance classes, I was told we couldn't afford extracurricular activities for everyone. The message was clear. Their needs came first. Mine came last. Christmas mornings were particularly painful examples of this favoritism. Marcus and Jake would wake up to piles of carefully wrapped presents, expensive gaming systems, and name-brand clothes they'd specifically requested. My gifts were always practical: school supplies, basic clothing from discount stores, maybe one small toy if I was lucky. Linda would explain to extended family that I was so easy to please and not materialistic like other children, making my disappointment sound like a character flaw, rather than a natural response to obvious inequity. During family dinners, conversations revolved around the boys' achievements and interests. When I tried to share news from school or stories about my friends, Linda would interrupt with some pressing concern about Marcus's grades or Jake's social life. My father would nod along, rarely asking follow-up questions about my day or expressing interest in my activities. I learned to stop trying, to sit quietly and listen to them discuss vacation plans I wouldn't be included in, or family traditions that somehow never applied to me. The subtle cruelty was in the consistency of it, not dramatic enough to call abuse, but persistent enough to make me feel like a visitor in my own home. The 3 people who saved my sanity during those years were my maternal grandmother Rose, my guidance counselor Mrs. Patterson, and my best friend Sarah's mother Carol. Grandma Rose lived 40 minutes away but made the drive every other Sunday to take me to lunch and really listen to what was happening in my life. She'd pick me up in her ancient blue Buick that smelled like vanilla air freshener and peppermints, and we'd drive to this little diner where she'd order the same chicken salad sandwich every time while I got a grilled cheese and chocolate milkshake. She never criticized my father or stepmother directly, but she had a way of validating my feelings without making me feel disloyal. "Rebecca," she'd say, stirring extra sugar into her coffee, "you have a good heart and a smart mind. Don't let anyone convince you that you're worth less than you are." Mrs. Patterson noticed when I started withdrawing in 7th grade, keeping me after class to ask gentle questions about how things were at home. She nominated me for academic programs and made sure I knew about scholarship opportunities, telling me repeatedly that education would be my ticket to independence. Carol treated me like a second daughter, including me in family traditions and making sure I felt welcomed and valued. When Sarah's family went camping, I was invited. When they had birthday celebrations, there was always a place for me at the table. These three women showed me what genuine care looked like, creating a stark contrast to the conditional acceptance I experienced at home. The day my life imploded started with me getting ready for what I thought would be a normal Tuesday at work. I had 3 client sessions scheduled, including a particularly difficult case involving a teenager who'd been in foster care since she was 7. I'd spent extra time the night before preparing materials and strategies to help her work through some trust issues. David had claimed he had an early meeting with a potential new client, kissing me goodbye quickly while I was still in my robe drinking coffee. But as I backed out of our driveway 20 minutes later, I saw his car still sitting there. Confused, I pulled back in and called his cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. I went back inside, calling his name, but got no response. That's when I heard the shower running in our guest bathroom upstairs, the one we never used because the water pressure was terrible. My heart started pounding as I climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. I called his name again, louder this time, and heard sudden movement and whispering. When I pushed open the bathroom door, I found David stepping out of the shower with Rebecca, his 26-year-old paralegal from his office. They were both naked, both shocked, and the look of guilt on David's face told me everything I needed to know about how long this had been going on. The immediate aftermath was a blur of shouting, tears, and desperate explanations that made no sense. David kept saying it wasn't what it looked like, even though it was exactly what it looked like. Rebecca grabbed a towel and fled to her clothes, while David tried to physically prevent me from leaving the house, grabbing my arms and begging me to listen to his side of the story. But there was no story that could explain this betrayal, no context that could make it acceptable. I called in sick to work and drove aimlessly for 2 hours, finally ending up at a park where David and I had gone on one of our first dates. Sitting on the same bench where he'd first told me he was falling in love with me, I called the one person I thought would understand the depth of my pain and offer comfort, my father. Through tears, I explained what had happened, how my marriage was falling apart, how I discovered David's affair in the most humiliating way possible. I expected sympathy, maybe an offer to come stay at their house for a few days while I figured out my next steps. Instead, my father's first question was whether I was sure I hadn't misunderstood what I'd seen. His second question was whether I'd considered what my reaction might do to David's career. Not once during that 15-minute phone call did he ask how I was feeling or what I needed from him. When I finally asked directly if I could come home for a few days, he said he'd have to check with Linda and get back to me. Check with Linda. Like I was a stranger requesting a favor instead of his daughter in crisis. 3 days later, I was still waiting for him to call back when my phone finally rang. It was Linda, not my father, and her tone was crisp and businesslike. She explained that they'd discussed my situation and decided it would be best for everyone if I figured out my living arrangements independently. She reminded me that I was a grown woman with a career and resources, unlike when I was a child who needed their care. She suggested I might want to consider whether I'd somehow contributed to David's infidelity by being too focused on work or not attentive enough to his needs. The conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes, but Linda managed to make me feel both abandoned and somehow responsible for my own betrayal. When I asked to speak to my father, she said he was busy with an important work call and would try to reach me later. He never called. That night, sitting alone in a hotel room because I couldn't bear to go back to the house I'd shared with David, I realized that this crisis had revealed something I'd been denying my entire life. I had never been their priority, and I never would be. The family I thought I belonged to had been an illusion, and at 47 years old, I was finally seeing clearly. 2 weeks after my world collapsed, my father finally reached out, not to offer support, but to suggest that I was being dramatic about the whole situation. This conversation took place in the parking lot of a Walmart, of all places, because that's where I happened to be when he called. I was buying basics to stock my temporary apartment, trying to rebuild my life from scratch, when his name appeared on my phone screen. Standing next to my shopping cart full of generic brand essentials, I answered hopefully, thinking he'd come to his senses and was calling to apologize for Linda's coldness. Instead, he spent 10 minutes explaining how marriages go through rough patches and how I shouldn't make any permanent decisions while I was emotional. He suggested that David was probably just going through a midlife crisis and that with some counseling we could work things out. When I tried to explain that this wasn't about a rough patch, but about a fundamental betrayal of trust, he interrupted me to say that divorce was expensive and complicated, and wouldn't it be easier to just forgive and move forward? The entire time he was talking, I could hear Linda in the background making comments, though I couldn't make out the specific words. It became clear that this call wasn't coming from his heart, but from their joint decision about how to handle my situation. When I asked directly whether he thought I deserved better than a cheating husband, he gave me some non-answer about marriage being work and compromise. The call ended with him saying he hoped I'd come to my senses soon and Linda shouting something about not wanting to enable my victim mentality. I hung up standing in a Walmart parking lot, surrounded by families loading groceries into their cars, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my entire life. The following week, I had to attend my nephew Jake's graduation party, an event that had been planned for months before my life fell apart. I almost didn't go, but Jake had specifically texted me asking me to be there, and I didn't want to disappoint him because of the adults' dysfunction. The party was held in Linda's perfectly manicured backyard, with white tent rentals and catered food that probably cost more than I was spending on rent for my temporary apartment. I arrived with a carefully chosen gift and a forced smile, hoping to blend into the background and just get through the celebration. What I discovered instead was that my personal crisis had become entertainment for Linda's friends and extended family. Within minutes of arriving, I overheard Linda telling her sister how I was finally learning some life lessons and how she'd always known David was too good to be true. Jake's graduation cake had been cut and served, but somehow no one had saved me a piece, despite there being obvious leftover portions. When family photos were being taken, Linda organized multiple groupings: grandparents with Jake, parents with Jake, siblings with Jake, but somehow I wasn't called for any of them. I spent the entire party feeling invisible, watching my father laugh and joke with Linda's relatives while avoiding eye contact with me. The breaking point came when I overheard Marcus telling his girlfriend that I'd probably driven David away by being too intense about work and not caring enough about my appearance. He was repeating almost word for word what Linda had said to me on the phone, making it clear that my private pain had become their public narrative. I left early, claiming a headache, and spent the drive home wondering when exactly I'd become the villain in my own story. 3 weeks later, the family called a meeting. Linda had sent a formal text message requesting that I come to their house Sunday afternoon to discuss some important family matters. The tone was ominous, and I spent the entire weekend dreading whatever they had planned. I arrived at exactly 2 o'clock to find my father, Linda, Marcus, and Jake all seated around their dining room table with serious expressions and a folder of papers in front of Linda. The atmosphere felt like a business meeting rather than a family discussion, which should have prepared me better for what was coming. Linda opened the conversation by expressing their collective concern about my recent behavior and my apparent inability to handle my personal crisis maturely. She had prepared what seemed like a rehearsed speech about how my emotional state was affecting the entire family dynamic and creating unnecessary drama for everyone. Then came the real purpose of the meeting. They wanted me to consider taking a temporary break from family gatherings and events until I could get my life together and stop bringing negative energy to their celebrations. They'd apparently discussed this extensively without me and decided that my presence was disruptive to their peace and happiness. My father sat silently while Linda presented their decision, occasionally nodding but never making eye contact with me. Marcus and Jake looked uncomfortable but said nothing in my defense. The papers in the folder turned out to be printouts of articles about divorce recovery and moving on, as if my problem was that I wasn't healing fast enough for their convenience. When I asked how long this temporary break was supposed to last, Linda said they'd revisit the situation in 6 months, or when I demonstrated significant improvement in my attitude. 6 months. They were essentially disowning me for half a year because dealing with my pain was inconvenient for them. The manipulation tactics they used during this meeting were subtle but unmistakable. Linda repeatedly referred to their concerns as coming from a place of love, claiming they were trying to help me heal by removing stress from my life. She suggested that being around happy family events was probably painful for me anyway, given my current situation, so really they were doing me a favor by excluding me. When I pointed out that isolation was the opposite of what someone in crisis needed, my father finally spoke up to say that I was proving their point by being argumentative and negative. They used my emotional response to their rejection as evidence that I was too unstable to be around them. Marcus chimed in to say that my situation was making family dinners awkward because no one knew what to say to me, as if my presence was the problem rather than their lack of empathy. Jake said he felt caught in the middle and just wanted things to go back to normal, which was apparently impossible as long as I was struggling openly with my circumstances. They'd position themselves as the reasonable ones trying to maintain family harmony while casting me as the disruptive force. When I asked whether they'd extend the same exclusion to someone with cancer or another serious illness, Linda said that was different because those weren't choices like my divorce was. According to their logic, I had chosen to be devastated by betrayal, chosen to need support during the worst period of my life, and therefore deserved the consequences of those choices. The meeting ended with them presenting me with a typed list of conditions I'd need to meet before being welcomed back, completing individual therapy, showing evidence of financial independence, and demonstrating a positive attitude about my future. They were treating my heartbreak like a character flaw that required correction rather than a natural response to trauma that required compassion. As summer turned into fall, their pressure campaign intensified in ways I never could have anticipated. Linda had apparently been busy recruiting allies, reaching out to extended family members with her version of recent events. Suddenly, I was receiving concerned calls from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, all parroting the same talking points about forgiveness and moving forward. My Aunt Margaret called to suggest that maybe I should consider what role I'd played in David's infidelity, while my Uncle Robert felt compelled to share statistics about divorce rates and the importance of working through marital problems. These calls always followed the same pattern: expressions of love and concern, followed by gentle pressure to reconcile with David or, failing that, to stop punishing the family for my personal problems. When I tried to explain that I wasn't punishing anyone, that I simply needed support during a difficult time, the response was always the same: I was being too sensitive, too dramatic, too unwilling to accept responsibility for my situation. Linda had clearly briefed them all on the appropriate talking points, turning my extended family into unwitting participants in her gaslighting campaign. The most hurtful part was realizing that these relatives had never bothered to hear my actual story, never asked what had really happened or how I was coping. They'd simply accepted Linda's narrative and joined her mission to pressure me back into compliance. The community pressure was equally devastating and more public. Linda was active in several local organizations, from the country club to the historical society to their church's women's auxiliary. Everywhere I went in our small town, I encountered people who'd been briefed on my situation and had opinions about how I should handle it. The pharmacist, where I'd been filling prescriptions for 15 years, suddenly felt comfortable asking when I'd be working things out with David. The hairdresser, who'd been cutting my hair for a decade, wanted to know if I'd considered couples counseling. Even the librarian had suggestions about books on forgiveness and healing. These weren't mean-spirited people. They genuinely thought they were being helpful. But the constant unsolicited advice and the underlying assumption that my marriage could be saved if only I tried harder was exhausting and demoralizing. I realized that Linda had positioned herself as the concerned family member trying to help a struggling relative, rather than the woman who'd abandoned that relative in her hour of need. The narrative had been successfully flipped. I was the stubborn one refusing help, not the victim of betrayal seeking basic compassion. When I stopped going to my usual coffee shop because the barista kept asking about David, I knew the isolation campaign was working exactly as Linda had intended. By October, the threats became more explicit and targeted. Linda called to inform me that if I didn't start participating in family events again, they would have to reconsider their relationship with me entirely. She was careful to phrase it as concern for family unity rather than an ultimatum, but the message was clear: comply or be completely cut off. She mentioned that they were planning Thanksgiving dinner and Christmas celebrations, and my continued absence would send the wrong message to the younger family members about the importance of family loyalty. When I pointed out that they were the ones who had requested my absence in the first place, she claimed that had been a temporary measure to give me space to heal, and my continued isolation was now my choice. The gaslighting was masterful. They'd forced me out, then blamed me for staying away, then threatened further punishment if I didn't return on their terms. The conversation became more heated when I refused to commit to attending upcoming events, and Linda's true feelings finally emerged. She accused me of being selfish and attention-seeking, of using my divorce as an excuse to manipulate the family's emotions. She said David had been by to visit them several times, seeming genuinely remorseful and eager to make amends, while I remained bitter and unforgiving. The implication was clear: my husband's betrayal was forgivable, but my response to it was not. When I hung up on her, she immediately called back to threaten that my father was prepared to make some difficult decisions about his relationship with me if I couldn't learn to be more respectful. The threats were no longer subtle. Meanwhile, I had spent these months not just grieving my marriage, but also preparing for the possibility that my family relationships were irreparably damaged. I'd started individual therapy to work through the trauma of David's betrayal and the deeper wound of my family's abandonment. My therapist helped me recognize the patterns of emotional neglect and conditional love that had shaped my entire life, giving me language for experiences I'd never been able to articulate before. I'd consulted with a family law attorney about protecting myself financially during the divorce proceedings, but also about the legal implications of some of Linda's more threatening statements. I'd started building a support network of friends and colleagues who could provide the emotional care my biological family had withheld. Most importantly, I'd been gathering information, screenshots of cruel text messages, voice recordings of threatening phone calls, and detailed documentation of every interaction. I was learning to protect myself in ways I'd never needed to before, developing the skills and resources that would serve me well in the confrontation I knew was coming. My 48th birthday was approaching, and I had a feeling it would provide the perfect opportunity for my family to make their ultimate power play. I was right. The confrontation happened at what was supposed to be my birthday dinner, an event I'd initially planned to skip until my father personally called to insist I attend. He said it would mean a lot to him to have his daughter there on her special day, and that Linda had planned something really nice to celebrate me. Against my better judgment and my therapist's gentle warnings, I agreed to go, hoping that maybe they'd genuinely reflected on their behavior and were ready to rebuild our relationship. I spent extra time getting ready, choosing a dress I felt confident in, and bringing a bottle of wine I thought they'd enjoy. When I arrived at their house at exactly 6 o'clock, I found the entire extended family gathered in their living room: Linda's sisters, their husbands, Marcus and Jake with their girlfriends, even some cousins I hadn't seen in years. The dining room table was set for 15 people with Linda's finest china and crystal, candles lit, and what appeared to be a celebration feast laid out beautifully. For a moment, I felt genuinely touched that they'd gone to such effort for my birthday. Then I noticed that there were only 14 chairs around the table, and a sick feeling started growing in my stomach. Linda greeted me with an overly warm hug and a bright smile, immediately taking my wine and announcing to the room that I'd finally decided to join them for a real family celebration. The phrasing felt loaded, implying that my previous absences had been by choice rather than by their explicit request. As everyone gathered around the table, it became clear that this wasn't exactly the supportive birthday celebration I'd hoped for. The conversation immediately turned to how wonderful it was that we were all together again, and how much they'd missed having me at family events. But there was an underlying tension, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. When my father stood up to make a toast, I expected the usual birthday wishes and expressions of love. Instead, he launched into a speech about the importance of family loyalty and forgiveness, about how life was too short to hold grudges, and about how proud he was when family members showed the maturity to move past their differences. He raised his glass and said he was grateful that I'd finally come to my senses and was ready to repair the relationships I'd damaged with my recent behavior. The entire room toasted to my apparent enlightenment, while I sat there realizing that they'd constructed a narrative in which I was the prodigal daughter returning home, rather than the wounded family member who'd been rejected in her time of need. The dinner conversation was carefully orchestrated to reinforce this narrative, while subtly pressuring me to conform to their expectations. Linda shared updates about David's life, mentioning that he'd been asking about me and seemed ready to work on rebuilding our marriage. Marcus talked about the importance of second chances and how everyone deserves forgiveness for their mistakes. Jake's girlfriend, who'd never met me before, felt comfortable offering advice about not letting pride prevent me from accepting help from people who loved me. Each comment was designed to sound supportive while actually invalidating my feelings and pushing me toward decisions they wanted me to make. When someone mentioned that David had seemed genuinely remorseful during his recent visits to their house, I couldn't hide my shock. They'd been meeting with my estranged husband behind my back, apparently counseling him on how to win me back while simultaneously punishing me for not taking him back. The betrayal within the betrayal was staggering. Every smile, every kind word, every apparent gesture of reconciliation had been carefully planned to manipulate me back into compliance with their wishes. Then came the moment that changed everything forever. As Linda was serving birthday cake she'd specially ordered from my favorite bakery, my father cleared his throat and announced that he had something important to share with the family. He said that recent events had made him reflect on what family really means and how important it is to be honest about our relationships and obligations. I assumed he was about to apologize for their treatment of me, maybe acknowledge that they'd handled my crisis poorly and promised to do better going forward. Instead, he looked directly at me and said, "Rebecca, I've been thinking a lot about our relationship, and I need you to understand that you're not really my daughter. Linda's children are my priority because they're my family, and you've never been anything more than an obligation I inherited when I married your mother." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I could feel the blood draining from my face as the room fell silent. He continued, explaining that he'd tried his best to raise me properly, but that I'd always been difficult and demanding, unlike Marcus and Jake, who showed proper respect and appreciation. He said that Linda had been more of a parent to me than I deserved, and that my recent behavior had proven that I didn't understand or value the sacrifices they'd made on my behalf. The entire family sat in stunned silence as he delivered this devastating assessment of our relationship, destroying decades of what I'd believed about my place in his life. When he finished, Linda reached over and squeezed his hand supportively, as if he'd just delivered difficult but necessary medicine rather than devastating his daughter on her birthday. The room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs and side conversations as family members tried to process what they'd just witnessed. Some of Linda's relatives nodded approvingly, as if they'd been waiting years for this truth to be spoken aloud. Others looked genuinely shocked and uncomfortable, apparently not expecting the evening to take such a cruel turn. Marcus and Jake stared at their plates, unwilling to make eye contact with anyone. I sat there for a moment, feeling like I was watching this scene happen to someone else, unable to fully absorb the magnitude of what my father had just said to me in front of our entire extended family. Then something shifted inside me, a clarity I'd never experienced before. I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope I'd been carrying around for 2 weeks, ever since I'd received the results of the DNA test I'd ordered impulsively during one of my sleepless nights. I'd been curious about my ancestry and health markers, never expecting the results to be relevant to my immediate situation. But now, looking at my father's smug face and Linda's satisfied expression, I knew exactly why I'd been guided to bring those papers with me tonight. I stood up slowly, feeling remarkably calm, despite the chaos of emotions swirling inside me. "Actually, Dad," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I think you need to see something before you continue with this narrative." I slid the DNA test results across the table to him, watching his expression change from confidence to confusion as he scanned the official letterhead. "Those results show that you are definitely my biological father, with 99.7% certainty. So your little speech about obligations and inherited responsibilities is interesting, but it's based on a lie you've apparently been telling yourself for years." The room went completely silent as he stared at the papers, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and something that looked like fear. Linda grabbed the papers from his hands, reading them quickly before looking up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, pure hatred mixed with panic. The truth was undeniable, printed in black and white with official seals and scientific certainty. He was my father, biologically and legally, and there was no way to argue with the evidence I'd just presented. I watched as 20 years of their constructed narrative crumbled in real time, as the comfortable lies they'd used to justify their treatment of me evaporated in the face of scientific fact. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Linda immediately accused me of fabricating the results, claiming that DNA tests could be easily faked and that I was clearly desperate enough to create false evidence. When my father remained silent, staring at the papers with a look of dawning realization, she turned her anger on him, demanding to know why he hadn't handled this situation properly years ago. Several family members began making excuses to leave early, clearly uncomfortable with the level of personal drama they'd just witnessed. Marcus finally spoke up to ask what this meant for the family going forward, while Jake simply got up and walked outside without saying anything to anyone. The carefully orchestrated birthday celebration had become a scene of family destruction, with everyone scrambling to understand how their assumptions about our relationships had been so fundamentally wrong. Linda began gathering the papers, claiming she needed to investigate their authenticity, but I calmly took photos of them with my phone before she could attempt to destroy them. I had copies at home, of course, but I wanted her to know that this evidence couldn't be disappeared or denied. I looked around the table at these people who had spent months convincing me that I was demanding too much, expecting too much, asking for more consideration than I deserved. "I want everyone here to understand something," I said, still standing at the head of the table where my father had just tried to disown me. "For 8 months, you've all treated me like I was being unreasonable for wanting support during the worst crisis of my life. You've told me I was too emotional, too demanding, too unwilling to accept responsibility for my own situation. You've excluded me from family events, gossiped about me in the community, and recruited other people to pressure me into accepting treatment that no human being should have to tolerate." I looked directly at my father, who was still staring at the DNA results. "And you just tried to justify decades of emotional neglect by claiming I wasn't really your responsibility. But now we all know that's not true. I am your daughter, biologically and legally, and nothing about that has ever been ambiguous or uncertain, which means every choice you've made about how to treat me has been exactly that, a choice." The room remained silent as I gathered my purse and coat, feeling lighter than I had in months despite the devastation of what had just occurred. Linda made one final attempt to control the narrative, standing up and calling after me as I headed toward the door. Rebecca, you're making a mistake. Family problems should be handled privately, not with dramatic gestures and public confrontations. I turned back to face her, feeling a strength I didn't know I possessed. You're absolutely right, Linda. Family problems should be handled privately, with love and support and patience. Too bad you never learned that lesson when I actually needed it. I walked out of their house for what I knew would be the last time, leaving behind a room full of people who would spend the rest of the evening trying to process what they'd just witnessed and their own complicity in years of emotional abuse. The drive home was surreal, a mixture of devastation and liberation that I couldn't have anticipated. I called my therapist's emergency line and left a message explaining what had happened, knowing I'd need professional support to process the evening's events. Then I called my friend Sarah, who'd been my emotional anchor throughout this entire ordeal, and told her everything while sitting in my car outside my apartment building. She listened without judgment, occasionally gasping at the cruelty of what my father had said, and then offered to come over with wine and ice cream to help me decompose. For the first time in months, I felt like I had people in my life who actually cared about my well-being, rather than their own convenience. The next morning, I woke up feeling something I hadn't experienced in almost a year: clarity about who belonged in my life and who didn't. The legal protection I sought was primarily about establishing boundaries rather than pursuing financial remedies. I consulted with an attorney about getting a restraining order if Linda's harassment escalated, and I documented all of our interactions in case I needed evidence of a pattern of emotional abuse. I changed my phone number and gave the new one only to people who had proven themselves trustworthy during my crisis. I blocked Linda and my father on all social media platforms and instructed mutual friends that I wouldn't be attending any events where they were present. The attorney also helped me understand my rights regarding inheritance and family property, ensuring that Linda couldn't manipulate legal documents to exclude me from anything that was rightfully mine. Most importantly, I created a detailed record of the DNA test results and the events of that birthday dinner, storing copies with my attorney and my therapist in case anyone ever tried to gaslight me about what had really happened. My support system rallied around me in ways that highlighted the stark contrast between healthy and toxic relationships. Sarah's family essentially adopted me for the holidays, including me in their traditions and making sure I never felt alone during what could have been a devastating season. My colleagues at work, who had watched me struggle with professional composure during the worst months of my personal crisis, stepped up with practical support and genuine friendship. My grandmother, Rose, despite being in her 80s, drove herself to my apartment the day after my birthday dinner to sit with me and validate everything I was feeling. "Honey," she said, holding my hands while we both cried, "I've watched your father make choices about you your whole life, and not one of them was about what you needed. You don't owe loyalty to people who never earned it." These relationships showed me what family actually looked like when it was based on love and choice rather than obligation and manipulation. The healing process was neither linear nor quick, but it was supported by people who understood that recovery takes time and patience. I increased my therapy sessions to twice weekly, working through not just the recent trauma but the lifetime of emotional neglect that had prepared me to accept such treatment. I joined a support group for adults who had experienced family estrangement, discovering that my story was unfortunately common and that healing was possible with the right resources. I started journaling regularly, documenting my thoughts and feelings as I rebuilt my sense of self-worth and learned to trust my own perceptions of reality. Physical self-care became a priority as I realized that emotional trauma had taken a toll on my health that I'd been ignoring. I started exercising regularly, eating better, and prioritizing sleep in ways that honored my body's need for healing. Most importantly, I began making decisions based on my own values and needs rather than other people's expectations, a radical shift after decades of people-pleasing and conflict avoidance. The question of reconciliation became more complex as time passed and some family members began reaching out independently. Jake contacted me 3 months after the birthday dinner, apologizing for his silence and asking if we could rebuild our relationship separately from the larger family drama. He admitted that he'd always known the favoritism was wrong, but had been afraid to speak up because it would have made his life more difficult. We started meeting for coffee once a month, slowly rebuilding trust and establishing boundaries that protected us both. A few of my cousins also reached out, explaining that they'd been given incomplete information about my situation and wanted to hear my side of the story. These individual relationships required careful navigation as I learned to distinguish between people who were genuinely sorry and those who were simply uncomfortable with the conflict. Some relationships could be repaired with clear boundaries and honest communication. Others were too damaged by their participation in the emotional abuse campaign to salvage. My father and Linda, however, never offered genuine accountability or meaningful change. They made several attempts to reestablish contact, but each one was focused on getting me to accept responsibility for the family discord rather than acknowledging their own behavior. Linda sent cards on major holidays with generic messages about forgiveness and moving forward, completely ignoring the specific harms she had caused. My father made a few awkward phone calls where he tried to minimize what had happened at the birthday dinner, claiming he'd been upset and hadn't meant what he'd said. But when I asked him to explain exactly what he was apologizing for and what he planned to do differently going forward, he became defensive and accused me of being unforgiving. Neither of them ever acknowledged the DNA test results or addressed the fundamental lie that had been exposed that night. Their attempts at reconciliation were really attempts to return to the status quo, where I absorbed their poor treatment without complaint, and I was no longer willing to accept that dynamic. What I learned through this experience was that some people will show you exactly who they are when you're at your most vulnerable, and it's crucial to believe them the first time. I learned that family loyalty is meaningless when it's only expected to flow in one direction, and that blood relationships don't automatically deserve more consideration than chosen relationships based on mutual care and respect. I discovered that I had been spending my entire adult life trying to earn love that was never actually available, pouring emotional energy into people who viewed my needs as inconvenient and my pain as manipulative. The crisis with David, devastating as it was, ultimately freed me from a family system that had been slowly destroying my self-worth for decades. I learned to recognize emotional manipulation and gaslighting, to trust my own perceptions even when other people tried to convince me I was overreacting or misunderstanding situations. Most importantly, I learned that protecting myself from harmful people isn't selfish or cruel. It's necessary for my mental health and spiritual well-being. If you're watching this and recognizing patterns from your own family relationships, I want you to know that you're not imagining things and you're not asking for too much. Wanting support during crisis is normal. Expecting basic respect and kindness from family members is reasonable. Refusing to accept emotional abuse isn't being dramatic or oversensitive. Trust your instincts about how you're being treated, even when other people try to convince you that you're wrong. Document interactions that feel abusive or manipulative, because gaslighting often makes us question our own memories and perceptions. Build relationships with people who demonstrate consistent care and support, rather than those who only show up when it's convenient for them. Set clear boundaries about what behavior you will and won't tolerate, and be prepared to enforce those boundaries even when it means losing relationships you thought were important. Seek professional help if you need support processing family trauma or learning healthy relationship skills. Remember that you can't control other people's choices, but you can control your own responses and who you allow access to your emotional energy. The community of people who understand this kind of family dysfunction is larger than you might think, and there's no shame in admitting that your biological family isn't capable of providing the love and support you deserve. Some of the strongest, most compassionate people I know have had to create their own families from friends, mentors, and chosen relatives who actually show up consistently with care and respect. Healing from family trauma is possible, but it requires acknowledging the reality of what happened rather than making excuses for people who hurt you. You deserve relationships that feel safe, supportive, and reciprocal. You deserve to be seen and valued for who you really are, not who other people need you to be for their convenience. And you deserve to build a life filled with people who celebrate your victories, comfort you during struggles, and never make you feel like you're asking for too much by simply existing as a whole human being with normal emotional needs. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and hearing from others who understand this experience helps all of us feel less alone. Hit the subscribe button if you want to hear more stories about overcoming family dysfunction and building healthier relationships. Remember that healing takes time, courage, and community, but it's absolutely possible to create the life and family you actually deserve. Your worth isn't determined by how other people treat you, and your future isn't limited by the family you were born into. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away from people who can't love you properly, and that's not giving up. That's growing up.